In a small, peaceful town where life moved at a slower pace, Walter Thompson was known as a man of quiet strength and unwavering dignity. At 72 years old, he had lived a life filled with challenges and triumphs, earning respect from everyone who crossed his path. A decorated Vietnam War veteran, Walter carried himself with an air of calm authority that commanded admiration. His stories of bravery during the war were legendary in the community, but what people loved most about him was his humility. He never sought attention or praise. Instead, he chose to live simply, finding joy in the little things, like tending to his garden, reading books on history, or taking long walks through the park near his home. On this particular afternoon, the sun hung high in the sky, casting golden rays over the lush greenery of the park. Birds chirped cheerfully, children laughed as they played tag, and couples strolled hand in hand along winding paths. Walter decided it was the perfect day for one of his favorite rituals, a leisurely walk. As he stepped onto the gravel path, he felt the familiar crunch beneath his shoes and took a deep breath of fresh air. The world seemed so serene, almost too good to be true. Little did Walter know, this tranquility would soon shatter. Meanwhile, on the outskirts of town, a group of bikers roared down the highway, their engines growling like wild beasts. They called themselves the Iron Reapers, a name meant to evoke fear and dominance. Their leader, Jake Malone, nicknamed Iron Fist for his reputation as a ruthless fighter, led the pack with reckless confidence. Jake wasn't just loud, he thrived on chaos. Whether it was bar fights, road rage incidents, or confrontations with strangers, he always looked for excuses to flex his muscles and prove he was the toughest guy around. Today, however, Jake wasn't looking for trouble, or so he claimed. The gang had planned to spend the afternoon drinking beer and showing off their bikes in the park, but as fate would have it, trouble found them first. As they approached the entrance to the park, weaving recklessly between cars and pedestrians, one of the bikers accidentally clipped Walter's shoulder while speeding past. It wasn't a hard hit, more of a nudge really, but enough to make Walter stumble slightly. Most people would have apologized immediately, maybe even offered a helping hand. Not Jake. Instead, he pulled his bike to a stop, removed his helmet, and glared at Walter with cold eyes. "Watch where you're going, old man," he barked, his voice dripping with disdain. Walter turned slowly, his expression calm despite the sudden interruption. He didn't recognize these men, nor did he care to engage with them. All he wanted was to continue his peaceful walk. "I believe your friend nearly ran me over," Walter replied evenly, his tone polite yet firm. "Perhaps you should remind him to slow down," Jake scoffed, clearly unimpressed by Walter's composure. To him, Walter was just another faceless nobody, an easy target for ridicule. "Oh, I'm sorry," Jake sneered sarcastically, stepping closer. "Did we hurt your feelings? Maybe you need to toughen up, Grandpa." The other bikers snickered, egging Jake on. Walter sighed inwardly, sensing the situation escalating unnecessarily. He had dealt with bullies before, both on the battlefield and in civilian life, and knew better than to let anger cloud his judgment. Still, something about Jake's arrogance grated on him. There was no honor in mocking someone weaker than yourself. It went against everything Walter stood for. Walter held up a hand, signaling peace. "There's no need for hostility here," he said gently, hoping to diffuse the tension. "Let's all go our separate ways." But Jake wasn't interested in walking away. If anything, Walter's calm demeanor only fueled his aggression. In Jake's mind, weakness deserved punishment, and Walter's refusal to fight back made him fair game. Without warning, Jake shoved Walter hard, sending him stumbling backward onto the ground. Gasps erupted from nearby onlookers as Jake delivered a swift punch to Walter's face, leaving him sprawled on the dirt path, blood trickling from a cut on his cheek. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Parents quickly ushered their children away, shielding them from the scene unfolding before them. Some bystanders rushed forward to help Walter, while others whipped out their phones to record the incident. Shock rippled through the crowd as they watched the elderly man struggle to sit up, his usually steady hands trembling slightly. Despite the pain, Walter refused to show fear or retaliate. He simply wiped the blood from his lip and looked up at Jake with sad, knowing eyes. Jake, emboldened by his gang's cheers, loomed over Walter, sneering down at him. "That'll teach you to mess with us," he spat, before turning back to his bike. The rest of the bikers followed suit, revving their engines and speeding off into the distance, leaving behind a trail of dust and shattered peace. As the commotion died down, one woman knelt beside Walter, offering him a tissue and asking if he needed medical attention. Walter shook his head, though he appreciated her kindness. "I'll be fine," he assured her, his voice steady despite the ache in his jaw. What bothered him more than the physical pain was the senselessness of it all. Why did some people feel the need to lash out at others? And why couldn't they see the harm their actions caused? Unbeknownst to Walter, however, help was already on the way. Across town, his son Marcus Thompson, a highly respected officer in the U.S. Army Special Forces, was driving home after completing a top-secret mission. Marcus had been looking forward to spending quality time with his father, catching up on stories and sharing laughter over dinner. But as he scrolled through his phone during a red light, a notification popped up on his screen. It was a video clip, shared thousands of times on social media. The caption read, "Elderly veteran brutally attacked by bikers." Marcus's heart sank as he pressed play. The footage showed his father being shoved and punched by a burly man in biker gear. Anger surged through him like wildfire, but years of military training kept his emotions in check. This wasn't just an attack on his father. It was an assault on everything Walter represented: honor, resilience, and service to the country. Someone needed to hold these men accountable. Without hesitation, Marcus dialed his commanding officer, explaining the situation and requesting emergency leave. To his relief, his CO not only approved the request but also offered additional support. Within minutes, Marcus contacted a trusted team of fellow soldiers stationed nearby. These men, battle-hardened veterans who owed their lives to Marcus, agreed to join him without question. Together they set out toward the park, determined to ensure justice was served. Back at the scene, Walter remained seated on the ground, surrounded by concerned strangers. Though shaken, he maintained his composure, refusing to let bitterness take root. After all, hatred only bred more hatred, and Walter had spent his life striving for something better. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this incident wasn't over, not yet. Something told him the storm was far from finished. The incident at the park left a deep mark on everyone who witnessed it. Walter, though physically hurt, remained seated on the ground as concerned bystanders hovered around him. Some offered words of comfort, while others urged him to seek medical attention. A young mother handed him a clean cloth to wipe away the blood trickling from his cheek, her eyes filled with both sympathy and anger. "Sir, you really should go to the hospital," she said softly, kneeling beside him. Walter shook, his head managing a faint smile despite the pain. "I've been through worse," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with weariness. The truth was, Walter wasn't just brushing off the attack. He genuinely believed that reacting with fear or outrage would only give the bikers more power over him. He had faced far greater dangers during his time in Vietnam, where survival often depended on keeping your wits about you. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. It was his hometown, a place where he thought he could walk freely without having to defend himself. The senselessness of the assault weighed heavily on his mind. What had he done to deserve such cruelty? Nothing. And that realization made the whole situation even harder to swallow. As word of the attack spread, the park quickly became a hub of activity. People gathered in small clusters, discussing what they had seen. Some expressed outrage, while others whispered prayers for Walter's well-being. Among them was a teenage boy named Ethan, who had filmed the entire incident on his phone. Ethan hadn't intended to record anything when he first noticed the commotion. He'd simply been sitting on a bench scrolling through social media when the sound of revving engines caught his attention. Curiosity led him to point his camera toward the scene, capturing every moment in vivid detail. Ethan hesitated before posting the video online. He knew sharing it might bring unwanted attention to the town, but he also felt a responsibility to expose the truth. After all, justice couldn't be served if no one knew what had happened. With trembling fingers, he uploaded the clip to a popular social media platform, adding a caption. "This is unacceptable. An elderly veteran was attacked today by a group of bikers. Please share so someone can help." Within minutes, the video went viral, racking up thousands of views and comments. Strangers from across the country flooded the thread with messages of support for Walter and calls for accountability against the attackers. Meanwhile, Marcus Thompson sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he replayed the video, over and over again. Each time he watched it, his jaw clenched a little harder, his knuckles turning white. The sight of his father being punched, humiliated in broad daylight, was unbearable. Marcus had always looked up to Walter, not just as a parent, but as a role model. Growing up, he'd listened intently to his father's war stories, marveling at how Walter had faced unimaginable challenges with courage and grace. Now, seeing him treated like this felt like a personal affront, not just to Walter, but to everything their family stood for. Marcus took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He knew losing control wouldn't solve anything. Instead, he focused on formulating a plan. First, he called his commanding officer, explaining the situation briefly but clearly. "Sir, my father has been assaulted," Marcus said, his voice firm despite the storm brewing inside him. "I need to take leave immediately to address this matter personally." To his surprise, his CO didn't hesitate. "Of course, son," came the reply. "Do what you need to do, and let me know if there's anything we can do to assist." With permission granted, Marcus wasted no time reaching out to his trusted team. These were men he had fought alongside in some of the most dangerous missions imaginable. They weren't just colleagues, they were brothers in arms bound together by shared experiences and mutual respect. One by one, Marcus contacted them, explaining the urgency of the situation. "Listen, I need your help," he said, his tone leaving no room for doubt. "These guys won't get away with this, not on our watch." Each member of the team responded, without hesitation. "Count me in," said Carter, a sniper known for his precision and loyalty. "Whatever you need, Marcus." Another teammate, Ramirez, chimed in with equal determination. "We'll make sure justice is served. Just tell us where to meet you." By the time Marcus ended the last call, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this fight. Together, they would ensure that Walter's attackers faced the consequences of their actions. While Marcus prepared for action, Jake Malone and his gang celebrated their perceived victory. Back at their clubhouse, a dilapidated building on the edge of town, they cracked open beers and laughed about the old geezer they'd roughed up earlier. Jake recounted the story with exaggerated bravado, mimicking Walter's stumble, and fall to uproarious applause from his friends. "Man, did you see his face?" Jake boasted, slamming his fist into his palm. "That'll teach him to mess with us." But not everyone in the group shared Jake's enthusiasm. One biker, a younger man named Tyler, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He hadn't been part of the actual assault, but he'd seen enough to know it was wrong. "Dude, don't you think we went too far?" Tyler asked cautiously, glancing around the room. "I mean, he's just an old guy. What if someone finds out?" Jake rolled his eyes, dismissing Tyler's concerns with a wave of his hand. "Relax, kid. Nobody's going to care about some washed-up vet. Besides, who's going to stop us, huh?" His confidence was infectious, silencing any lingering doubts among the group. For now, they believed they were untouchable. What Jake didn't realize, however, was that the world was already watching. Social media had amplified Ethan's video beyond the confines of the small town, drawing national attention to the incident. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting clips of the attack alongside interviews with outraged citizens. Comment. Sections exploded with demands for justice, with many calling for harsh penalties against Jake and his gang. Even local law enforcement couldn't ignore the growing pressure. Officers began reviewing the footage, piecing together evidence to identify the perpetrators. Back in the park, Walter finally managed to stand, leaning heavily on the arm of a kind stranger. Though battered and bruised, he refused to let the attack define him. As he limped toward a nearby bench, he reflected on the irony of the situation. Here he was, a man who had once fought to protect his country, now victimized by the very freedoms he had helped secure. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Walter chose to focus on the positives. The outpouring of support from strangers reminded him that kindness still existed in the world, even in its darkest moments. Little did Walter know, reinforcements were already en route. Marcus and his team sped toward the park, their vehicles blending seamlessly into the suburban landscape. Dressed in plain clothes but carrying an unmistakable air of authority, they moved with purpose, ready to confront the bikers and restore order. For Marcus, this wasn't just about avenging his father, it was about sending a message. No one messed with a veteran and got away with it, not on his watch. As Marcus and his team approached the park, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The once peaceful space now buzzed with tension, a stark contrast to the calm Walter had enjoyed earlier that day. People lingered cautiously, whispering among themselves, as they debated whether it was safe to stay or if they should leave. Some glanced nervously toward the far end of the park, where Jake and his gang still loitered, oblivious to the storm heading their way. The bikers sat on benches drinking from cans of beer and laughing loudly, their voices carrying across the open space like an unwelcome echo. Marcus parked his SUV at the edge of the lot, careful not to draw immediate attention. His teammates followed suit, parking discreetly nearby. Before stepping out, Marcus turned to face them, his expression serious but controlled. "Listen up," he said in a low, steady voice. "We're here to handle this professionally. No unnecessary force. Just enough to show them they can't act like this without consequences. Understood?" Each member nodded silently, their faces reflecting the same determination that burned in Marcus's eyes. They were soldiers, trained to operate under pressure, and they knew exactly how to de-escalate, or escalate, a situation when needed. Stepping out of the vehicle, Marcus scanned the area, taking note of every detail: the position of the bikers, the scattered groups of onlookers, and the subtle signs of fear etched onto people's faces. He adjusted his jacket, ensuring it covered the tactical gear he wore underneath. This wasn't about showing off. It was about being prepared for anything. As he moved forward with his team close behind, heads began to turn. Their presence alone commanded attention. There was something unmistakable about the way they carried themselves, shoulders squared, strides purposeful, that set them apart from ordinary civilians. Jake and his gang noticed the newcomers almost immediately. At first, they dismissed them as curious bystanders, perhaps locals drawn by the commotion. But as Marcus and his team drew closer, Jake's cocky demeanor faltered slightly. Something about these men didn't sit right with him. For one, they weren't dressed like typical townsfolk. Their clothes were practical yet polished, exuding a quiet confidence that made Jake uneasy. And then there was the way they moved, calm, deliberate, and synchronized, as though they shared a single mind. Marcus stopped a few feet away from the bikers, his piercing gaze locking onto Jake. "You," he said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that silenced everyone within earshot. Jake straightened instinctively, trying to mask his discomfort with bravado. "What do you want?" he shot back, attempting to sound tough, but failing to hide the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "I'm looking for the guy who decided it was okay to punch an elderly man in broad daylight," Marcus replied evenly, his tone dripping with disdain. He took a step closer, closing the gap between them. "Care to explain yourself?" Jake hesitated, caught off guard by the directness of the question. He glanced around at his friends for support, but none of them stepped forward. Instead, they exchanged nervous looks, sensing that this stranger wasn't someone to be trifled with. Desperate to regain control of the situation, Jake sneered and crossed his arms. "Who the hell are you supposed to be, some kind of hero?" Marcus allowed himself a faint smirk, though it held no warmth. "Not a hero," he corrected. Just the son of the man you attacked." The words landed like a punch, sending a ripple of shock through the crowd. Gasps erupted from those watching, and even some of the bikers looked genuinely surprised. Jake's bravado wavered further, replaced by a flicker of panic. He hadn't expected this turn of events. Not here. Not now. Before Jake could respond, Marcus continued, his voice rising slightly to ensure everyone heard him. "Let me make one thing clear," he said, gesturing subtly to his team, who stood ready in case things escalated. "I don't care what kind of reputation you think you have, or how many fights you've won. You picked the wrong person to mess with today. My father is a decorated veteran who served this country honorably while you were probably still learning how to ride your first bike. And you piece of trash, had the audacity to lay a hand on him." The crowd murmured, in agreement, emboldened by Marcus's words. For so long they had felt powerless in the face of Jake's aggression, but seeing someone stand up to him gave them hope. A few people even clapped softly, their applause growing louder as others joined in. Jake shifted uncomfortably, his usual arrogance crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. "You don't know what you're talking about," Jake muttered. Though his voice lacked conviction, "That old man got in our way. He had it coming." Marcus raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Oh, really? Is that how you justify attacking someone half your size? Someone who couldn't possibly fight back?" He paused, letting the question hang in the air before adding, "Tell me, Jake, does it make you feel tough to pick on the weak? Or is it just easier than facing someone who might actually challenge you?" The jab hit its mark. Jake's face reddened with anger, and for a moment it seemed like he might lash out. But Marcus anticipated this. With a swift motion, he signaled to his team, who instantly surrounded the bikers, forming a tight semicircle that left no room for escape. The message was clear. Any attempt at resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Yet despite their intimidating stance, Marcus and his team remained calm and composed, their professionalism shining through. Realizing he was outnumbered and outmatched, Jake finally cracked. All right, he snapped, throwing up his hands in surrender. "We didn't mean any harm, okay? It was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Marcus repeated incredulously, his voice laced with sarcasm. "Is that what you call punching a defenseless man in front of witnesses? Because I'm pretty sure the video says otherwise." He gestured toward a nearby bystander holding a phone, reminding Jake that his actions had been recorded and broadcast to the world. By now, the rest of the gang had fallen silent, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. Some avoided eye contact altogether, while others fidgeted nervously, clearly regretting their involvement. Even Tyler, the youngest biker who had expressed doubts earlier, looked visibly relieved that the situation was being taken out of their hands. Marcus stepped closer to Jake, lowering his voice so only the bikers could hear. "Here's what's going to happen next," he said firmly. "You and your friends are going to stay right here until the police arrive. If anyone tries to run, my team will stop them. Trust me, you don't want that." His tone left no room for argument, and Jake nodded reluctantly, knowing resistance was futile. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. Onlookers whispered excitedly, speculating about what would happen next. Some praised Marcus openly, calling him a hero for standing up to the bullies. Others simply watched in awe, marveling at the efficiency and discipline displayed by his team. Meanwhile, Jake and his gang sat slumped on the benches, defeated and humiliated. For the first time in their lives, they understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of justice. When local law enforcement finally arrived, sirens blaring, the scene was already under control. Officers quickly assessed the situation, taking statements from witnesses and reviewing the viral video. Thanks to Marcus and his team, there was more than enough evidence to charge Jake and his gang with multiple offenses, including assault and disorderly conduct. As handcuffs clicked into place around Jake's wrists, he glared at Marcus with thinly veiled hatred. But deep down, he knew he'd brought this upon himself. For Marcus, however, the work wasn't over. After ensuring the bikers were securely in custody, he turned his attention back to the crowd. "Thank you all for your support," he said sincerely. addressing the gathered onlookers. "This isn't just about my father. It's about standing up for what's right. Let this be a reminder that we can't let fear dictate how we live our lives. Together we can make sure justice prevails." His words resonated deeply, earning cheers and applause from the crowd. As the officers led Jake and his gang away, Marcus finally allowed himself a moment of relief. Justice had been served, for now. But he knew the real test lay ahead, helping his father heal, both physically and emotionally, and ensuring that incidents like this never happened again in their community. With the bikers securely in handcuffs and local law enforcement taking charge of the situation, Marcus finally allowed himself a moment to breathe. The adrenaline that had surged through him during the confrontation began to ebb, leaving behind a mix of emotions, relief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of responsibility. He glanced around the park, taking in the faces of the bystanders who had witnessed everything unfold. Some were still clapping softly, their expressions filled with gratitude, while others simply looked relieved that the chaos had ended. Despite the resolution, however, Marcus knew there was still unfinished business. Turning away from the scene, he scanned the crowd for one face in particular, his father's. It didn't take long to spot Walter sitting on a bench near the edge of the park surrounded by concerned strangers. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the toll the attack had taken on him. His usually upright posture was slightly slouched, and there was a faint bruise forming along his jawline. But what struck Marcus most was the look in Walter's eyes. Not fear or bitterness, but quiet resilience. That unwavering strength was something Marcus had always admired about his father, even as a child. Now seeing it firsthand after such an ordeal, it filled him with both pride and heartache. Marcus approached cautiously, not wanting to startle Walter or overwhelm him further. As he drew closer, Walter raised his head and noticed his son standing there. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and an unspoken understanding passed between them. Walter gave a small nod, acknowledging Marcus's presence without saying a word. It was enough for Marcus to know that his father was okay, or at least as okay as someone could be after being attacked in such a humiliating way. "Dad," Marcus said softly, kneeling beside the bench so they were eye level. "Are you all right?" Walter let out a slow breath, his lips curving into a faint smile despite the pain etched on his face. "I've been better," he admitted, his voice steady but tinged with fatigue. "But I'll live." That simple statement carried so much weight. Walter wasn't just talking about surviving the physical injuries. He was referring to the emotional scars left behind by the incident. Marcus understood this implicitly. Growing up, he had learned early on that some wounds healed faster than others. Physical bruises faded over time, but the memory of being treated like less than human, that lingered far longer. "I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "If I'd known..." Walter cut him off gently, placing a weathered hand on Marcus's shoulder. "You couldn't have known," he said firmly. "And besides, you're here now. That's what matters." The simplicity of his words struck Marcus deeply. Walter had always been a man of few words, but when he spoke, every sentence carried meaning. In that moment, Marcus realized how lucky he was to have a father like Walter, not just because of his wisdom, but because of his ability to forgive and move forward. Most people would have harbored anger or resentment after such an attack, but Walter chose to focus on the positive, the fact that justice had been served and that his son had come to his aid. As Marcus helped Walter stand, several bystanders stepped forward to offer assistance. One woman handed Walter a bottle of water, while another insisted on driving him home if needed. Walter thanked them graciously, though he politely declined their offers. "I appreciate your kindness," he told them, "but my son has it covered." There was a quiet pride in his voice as he said those words, and Marcus felt a swell of affection for his father. Even in his weakened state, Walter refused to appear helpless or dependent on others. Together, father and son made their way toward Marcus's SUV, walking slowly to accommodate Walter's injuries. Along the way, Marcus kept glancing at Walter, searching for any signs of discomfort. "Does anything hurt badly?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. We can stop by the hospital if you need to get checked out. Walter shook his head, waving off the suggestion. No hospitals, he replied firmly. Just a little rest is all I need. Trust me, I've dealt with worse. Marcus wanted to argue, to insist that Walter at least see a doctor to rule out internal injuries, but he knew better than to push too hard. Walter had always been stubborn when it came to accepting help, especially when it came to his health. Instead, Marcus decided to compromise. Fine, he said, opening the passenger door for Walter. But promise me you'll let me know if anything feels off later, okay? No arguments. Walter chuckled softly, easing himself into the seat. Deal, he agreed, though Marcus could tell he was humoring him more than anything else. Once they were settled in the car, Marcus took a moment to collect his thoughts before starting the engine. He glanced at Walter again, noticing the way his father stared out the window, lost in thought. Do you want to talk about it? Marcus asked, gently. What happened back there? I mean. For a long moment, Walter remained silent, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to speak. It's funny, he said, his tone contemplative rather than bitter. All these years I've tried to teach people the importance of respect, of treating others the way you'd want to be treated. And yet here we are. Sometimes no matter how hard you try, there will always be those who refuse to listen. His words resonated deeply with Marcus, stirring memories of his own experiences in the military. On countless missions, he had encountered individuals who thrived on chaos and cruelty, people who saw violence as a means to an end. Yet, even in the darkest corners of the world, Marcus had also found examples of humanity, acts of kindness, and courage that reminded him why fighting for justice mattered. Not everyone chooses to listen, Marcus said quietly. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. What you did today, staying calm, refusing to retaliate, that's the kind of example people need to see. Walter turned to look at his son, his expression softening. You sound like your old man, he teased, though there was a hint of pride in his voice. Maybe I taught you better than I thought. Marcus grinned, feeling a rare moment of lightness amidst the heaviness of the day. Well, I did learn from the best, he replied, earning a chuckle from Walter. Their conversation shifted naturally to lighter topics as Marcus drove them home. They talked about Marcus's recent mission, sharing stories and laughter in a way that only family could. For Walter, these moments were a reminder of why he had fought so hard to protect his country, not for glory or recognition, but for the chance to create a better future for his loved ones. And for Marcus, spending time with his father reinforced the values he had grown up with: honor, integrity, and compassion. When they finally arrived at Walter's house, Marcus insisted on helping him inside and making sure he was comfortable. He fetched ice packs for Walter's bruises and prepared a cup of tea, determined to do whatever he could to ease his father's recovery. As Walter settled into his favorite armchair, he looked up at Marcus with genuine gratitude. Thank you, son, he said softly, for everything. Marcus knelt beside him, placing a hand on his father's knee. Always, Dad, he replied. Always. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm golden glow over the neighborhood. It was a stark contrast to the turmoil of earlier that day, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could still break through. As Marcus stood by the window, watching the sky change colors, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about protecting his father. It was about standing up for what was right no matter the cost. And as long as he had Walter by his side, he knew they could face anything together. The days following the incident at the park brought a whirlwind of activity to the small town. News outlets continued to cover the story, with headlines like, Hero Son Defends Elderly Veteran Father, and Community Rallies Behind Assaulted War Hero. The viral video of Jake attacking Walter had sparked outrage across the country, turning what might have been a local dispute into a national conversation about respect, accountability, and justice. People from all walks of life weighed in. Veterans shared their own stories of mistreatment. Activists called for stricter laws against hate crimes, and ordinary citizens expressed solidarity with Walter and his family. For Marcus and Walter, however, life moved forward quietly. They spent much of their time together at home, recovering and reflecting on everything that had happened. Walter's bruises were healing, though he still winced occasionally when moving too quickly. Marcus hovered nearby, ensuring his father didn't overexert himself while subtly encouraging him to open up about how he was feeling. Despite his usual stoicism, Walter eventually admitted that the attack had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the punch, he confessed one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. It was the disrespect, the way he looked at me like I didn't matter. Marcus nodded, understanding exactly what his father meant. He had seen similar attitudes during his time in the military, people dismissing others based on age, race, or perceived weakness. It was a mindset rooted in ignorance, one that thrived on fear and insecurity. But instead of dwelling on the negativity, Marcus steered the conversation toward something positive, the outpouring of support they'd received since the incident. "You know, Dad, this whole thing has shown me just how many good people are out there," he said thoughtfully. "Strangers sending messages, neighbors offering help. It's proof that kindness still exists, even when it feels like the world is falling apart." Walter smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "That's true," he agreed. "And maybe that's the lesson here. We can't control what other people do, but we can choose how we respond. If anything, this mess has reminded me why it's important to keep fighting, not with fists but with heart." Their quiet moments of reflection were interrupted by frequent visits from friends, neighbors, and even strangers who wanted to show their support. One afternoon, a group of local veterans stopped by, bringing homemade meals and heartfelt words of encouragement. "We heard what happened," said Tom, a retired Marine who lived down the street. "Just wanted to let you know you're not alone, Walter. We've got your back." Walter thanked them warmly, visibly moved by their gesture. For someone who rarely sought attention, these acts of kindness meant the world to him. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against Jake and his gang began to unfold. Thanks to the overwhelming evidence, video footage, witness statements, and testimony from law enforcement, the case was strong. Jake faced multiple charges, including assault, battery, and disorderly conduct, while several members of his gang were also implicated for their roles in the altercation. Public pressure mounted as news of the arrests spread, with many calling for severe penalties to send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Jake, now sitting in jail awaiting trial, found himself isolated and humiliated. Gone was the swaggering confidence he once carried. In its place was a man desperate to save face. During interrogations, he tried to shift blame onto his friends, claiming he had only acted in self-defense. But his attempts to manipulate the truth fell flat when confronted with irrefutable evidence. Even his own lawyer privately advised him to plead guilty in exchange for leniency, a suggestion Jake rejected outright, convinced he could somehow wriggle free of responsibility. Back in the community, preparations were underway for a special event organized by residents to honor Walter and raise awareness about veteran rights. Dubbed Stand Together, the gathering aimed to celebrate courage, resilience, and unity. Flyers went up around town, inviting everyone to attend a ceremony featuring speeches, music, and a moment of silence for fallen heroes. Local businesses donated food and supplies, while volunteers worked tirelessly to transform the park where the attack had occurred into a symbol of hope and healing. On the day of the event, the park buzzed with energy. Families gathered under colorful tents, children played games set up by organizers, and musicians performed patriotic songs that echoed through the trees. At the center of it all stood a makeshift stage adorned with American flags and banners, bearing inspirational quotes. As Marcus helped Walter navigate through the crowd, they were met with applause and cheers from attendees. Some approached Walter to shake his hand or share personal stories of gratitude, while others simply offered hugs and kind words. When it came time for speeches, Marcus stepped onto the stage, drawing immediate silence from the audience. Dressed in civilian clothes but carrying himself with the same discipline and poise he displayed in uniform, he began by thanking everyone for coming. "Today isn't just about my father. he said, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. It's about standing together as a community, to say no to hate, yes to respect, and always to justice. He went on to recount the events of that fateful day in the park, emphasizing the importance of speaking out against wrongdoing. My dad taught me early on that strength isn't about throwing punches, it's about standing tall, even when the odds are stacked against you, Marcus explained. And that's exactly what he did. He showed us all what true courage looks like. As he spoke, Marcus glanced down at Walter, who sat in the front row listening intently. Their eyes met briefly, and Marcus saw pride shining in his father's gaze. Finishing his speech, he invited Walter to join him on stage, a move that elicited thunderous applause from the crowd. Though initially hesitant, Walter rose slowly and made his way to the microphone, leaning heavily on his cane. "Thank you all for being here today," Walter began, his voice soft but steady. "I never imagined something like this would happen, to me, or that it would bring so many wonderful people together. What I want you to take away from this is simple. No matter who you are or where you come from, your actions matter. Whether it's choosing to stand up for someone in need or refusing to tolerate injustice, every decision counts." His words resonated deeply, prompting tears and nods of agreement throughout the audience. By the end of his speech, the entire park erupted in cheers, chanting Walter's name as if he were a hero returning from battle. For Walter, it was both overwhelming and humbling, an affirmation that his life's work of promoting peace and dignity had not gone unnoticed. As the Yao sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the festivities, Marcus and Walter stood side by side, taking in the scene before them. The park, once marred by violence, had been transformed into a place of unity and celebration. Strangers became friends, sharing laughter and stories as the stars began to twinkle above. In that moment, it was clear that the ripple effect of Walter's resilience and Marcus's determination had touched countless lives. Though challenges undoubtedly lay ahead, the upcoming trial, lingering emotional scars, and the ongoing fight for justice, father and son faced them together, strengthened by their bond and supported by a community that refused to let darkness prevail. As they walked home under the starlit sky, neither spoke, content to simply exist in the quiet comfort of each other's presence. For Walter and Marcus, this was more than a victory. It was a testament to the power of love, honor, and unwavering resolve. In the weeks that followed the Stand Together event, life in the small town began to settle into a new rhythm. The park, once a battleground of fear and aggression, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. Parents felt safe letting their children play there again. Couples strolled hand in hand along its winding paths, and veterans often gathered on benches to share stories and camaraderie. Walter, though still recovering from his injuries, found himself drawn back to the place where everything had unfolded, not out of obligation, but because it reminded him of what could be achieved when people came together for a common cause. Every morning, Walter resumed his leisurely walks, taking time to greet neighbors and thank those who stopped him with kind words or offers of help. His presence alone seemed to inspire others, serving as a quiet reminder that strength wasn't about physical power. It was about enduring hardships with dignity and grace. Children would run up to him, asking if he was the brave man from the videos, and Walter would chuckle softly before kneeling down to their level. "Bravery isn't about being strong," he'd tell them gently. "It's about doing what's right, even when it's hard." Marcus, too, noticed the subtle changes in the community. After returning to his military duties, he remained in touch with local leaders and organizers, ensuring that the momentum sparked by the incident didn't fade. He worked closely with schools and veteran organizations to create programs aimed at fostering respect and understanding among younger generations. One initiative, called Honor Our Heroes, encouraged students to write letters to veterans, thanking them for their service and learning about the sacrifices made on their behalf. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of heartfelt notes poured in, many addressed specifically to Walter. The trial of Jake Malone and his gang finally arrived, drawing significant attention both locally and nationally. News crews set up outside the courthouse, capturing every detail as the proceedings unfolded. Inside, The courtroom was packed with spectators eager to see justice served. Walter and Marcus sat side by side in the front row, flanked by members of the veteran community and supporters from across the town. Despite the gravity of the situation, Walter carried himself with the same calm composure that had defined him throughout the ordeal. To him, this wasn't about revenge, it was about accountability. During the trial, prosecutors presented irrefutable evidence. Ethan's viral video, witness testimonies, and expert analyses of Jake's aggressive behavior. Jake's attempts to paint himself as a victim fell flat under cross-examination, leaving him visibly frustrated and increasingly defensive. When it came time for closing arguments, the prosecutor delivered a powerful speech. "This case is not just about one act of violence," she said, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "It's about sending a message that we will not tolerate hatred, disrespect, or cruelty, especially toward those who have sacrificed so much for our freedom." When the verdict was announced, there was a collective exhale from the crowd. Jake was found guilty on all counts, sentenced to several years in prison, along with mandatory anger management counseling. Several members of his gang received lighter sentences after cooperating with authorities and expressing remorse for their actions. As the judge delivered the ruling, Walter closed his eyes briefly, letting out a slow breath. It wasn't triumph he felt, it was relief. Relief that justice had been served, and that perhaps, just perhaps, Jake might learn something from his mistakes. After the trial, the media frenzy slowly subsided, allowing Walter and Marcus to return to some semblance of normalcy. Yet, the impact of the incident lingered in meaningful ways. Walter became a sought-after speaker, invited to schools, community centers, and even national conferences to share his story. His talks weren't focused on the attack itself, but rather on themes of forgiveness, resilience, and the importance of standing up against injustice. Audiences listened intently, moved not only by his words but by the quiet authority with which he spoke. Marcus, meanwhile, continued to balance his military career with his role as a protector of his family and community. Though he traveled frequently for work, he always made time to visit his father, bringing updates on the initiatives he'd helped launch. Together, they discussed plans for a memorial garden in the park, a tribute to veterans and a space for reflection. Fundraising efforts quickly gained traction, with donations pouring in from across the country. By spring, construction began, transforming a neglected corner of the park into a serene oasis filled with flowers, benches, and engraved plaques honoring fallen heroes. One sunny afternoon, months after the trial, Walter stood beside Marcus at the grand opening of the memorial garden. A modest ceremony marked the occasion, complete with speeches, music, and a moment of silence for those who had given their lives in service. As Walter gazed at the finished project, tears welled in his eyes, not of sadness but of gratitude. "This is more than I ever imagined," he whispered to Marcus, his voice thick with emotion. "It's beautiful." Marcus smiled, placing a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder. "You deserve it, Dad," he replied. "All of this happened because you refused to let hate win." As the day drew to a close, father and son lingered in the garden, watching as visitors wandered through the pathways, reading inscriptions and leaving flowers at the base of statues. Walter leaned heavily on his cane, but there was a lightness to his step that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful, not just for himself, but for the future of the community he loved. That evening, as they walked home together beneath a canopy of stars, Marcus turned to Walter with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think things will stay like this?" he asked quietly. "Peaceful, I mean." Walter paused, considering the question carefully. "I don't know," he admitted after a moment. "There will always be challenges, always be people who try to divide us. But as long as we stand together, as families, as communities, as human beings, we'll find a way to overcome them." He glanced at Marcus, pride shining in his eyes. "And besides, we've got each other. That's enough to face anything." Marcus nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him. Whatever lay ahead, whether it was another mission overseas or simply navigating the ups and downs of everyday life, he knew they would face it side by side. Together, they had weathered storms, confronted injustice, and emerged stronger than ever, and in doing so they had inspired countless others to do the same. As they stepped onto the porch of Walter's house, the lights of the neighborhood glowing warmly in the distance, Marcus couldn't help but smile. Life wasn't perfect, and it never would be. But in moments like these, moments of connection, love, and shared purpose, he realized that perfection wasn't the goal. The goal was to keep moving forward, to keep fighting for what mattered most. And for Walter and Marcus Thompson, that fight was far from over.